Today's session, we're going to be discussing nurturing child and parent development with our return presenter. We're very excited about it, Dr. Pradeep Gidwani. I have a few words to say about him, and then we're going to dive right into content because there is a lot to review today. I've prepared a little information for you. Here it is. So Dr. Pradeep Gidwani is a pediatrician and community health leader who works at American Academy of Pediatrics, California, Chapter 3, San Diego and Imperial counties. That would be AAPCA3, on a team that provides county-wide coordination and support for two large-scale community initiatives, which would be Healthy Development Services and First 5 Home Visiting, funded by the First 5 San Diego. He's also medical director for AAPCA3's ACEs Aware work. Over the last 14 years, these community-wide programs have reached over 334,000 children and their families. Wait, sorry. I thought I was sharing my screen. Thank goodness I am not. Dr. Gidwani is a past president of AAPCA3 and a member of the board governors at the San Diego Foundation and serves on various community advisor boards. His area of expertise includes child development, infant and early childhood mental health, childhood trauma, parents' perception of childhood behaviors, and cultural issues in healthcare. With that, Dr. Gidwani, we're so grateful and excited to have you back, and we're looking forward to your discussion today.
Thank you, Jessica. And I do make a little bit of one of the things we try not to overload you with information. However, there is a lot of information, so we're going to move through. And if you have questions, as Jessica said, just pop them into the Q&A piece, and then she's going to help me by jumping in and just asking questions as we go. So by no means do you need to wait to have your questions answered. And if we don't get through all the slides, that's okay. Some of the material at the end is really bonus material. So just to let you know kind of where I'm coming from and what inspires me, as I was going to college and working in a variety of things, I came across an individual named Barry Brazelton. And Barry Brazelton is just a wonderful pediatrician. He just passed away recently at 100 years old and was still going into the office because he just loved his work. And he's a pediatrician who actually was on PBS, and he really said for frazzled parents, I'd really like them to learn that they can understand that their baby by watching their baby's behavior. And I think that's a huge part of the theme of my work is that children's behavior is a language, and we need to look at it. One of the things that I love about Dr. Brazelton was his work around what's known as touch points. And he basically said that there are these predictable periods of regression and disorganization that occur before bursts of development in a child. So that, these bursts come at times like when a child starts to walk, they may not sleep through the night anymore. And again, the regressions in the child's behavior creates disorganization for the parents. So again, just that whole thing of being very parent-centered, very supportive. And he felt that if we could help parents understand and predict when these changes were coming and equip them with that skills and knowledge, that would be great for parents and for children. So why nurture? Well, nurture essentially, I would actually like to start a field called nurturology. And nurture is just to care for or encourage the growth and development of. And it could be, in my case, I really love working with children, but it could be with colleagues, it could be with plants, it could be with animals. But nurture is part of our nature. And it occurs when a parent or caregiver is available and is able to sensitively respond and meet their child's needs. And we'll be talking about the attachment relationship, but this interaction, this responsiveness in relationships is critical. And I like to say that nurturing relationships are love in action, and nurturing relationships help us build better brains, healthy attachment, social emotional intelligence, self-regulation, and resilience. And one of the things I like to talk about with resiliency is we hear this term resiliency, and we'll talk about it a little bit later on, but resiliency is really developed in the context of relationships. Yes, some of us can pull ourselves up by our bootstraps, but when we look back and see what helped us become resilient, there's usually someone there that helped us. And I can't resist this picture because nurturing relationships are inborn. I mean, truly, we are wired to connect, and we're wired to nurture. This next slide is funny. It's a little bit complicated. It's my organization at the national level, the American Academy of Pediatrics, that basically say in the green is ecology or the environment, both the social and physical environment of children impacts biology. That's a circle in red, and that biology impacts development. And likewise, these things are interconnected and interdependent. And that's really the science of pediatrics, is this idea of a ecobiologic biodevelopmental model. And so it's of health and disease, and it's really important. And some of the other work that I do is really looking at early trauma and how that impacts our health. And if you're interested in that, if you just Google search me and search me with my credentials, both my MD and my MPH, the first video that pops up is something called the neurobiology of the child. And it's a really kind of a nice, about an hour and a half video of that work. So the reason I say put all of my initials in is not because I have an ego about it, but if you do just MD, there's a Pradeep Gidwani who's the managing director of Foster Beer in India. So he does not talk about the neurodevelopment of children. So if you are interested after this talk for more trauma specific stuff, that's just a free resource on the internet. And it's also important to remember that children really develop in the context of relationships, and they are, surrounded by their family, but also are in their community and their society. And how we work and how we think as a society and in our communities really has a profound impact on children. So one of the things that happened in COVID that was actually a positive was changes in the earned income tax credit for parents who have children. And a couple of things were really interesting about that. It actually raised 30% of kids out of poverty. And we know that poverty has profound impact on kids' development. It also allowed parents that had too low of an income to receive assistance. And of course, there's a lot of cynicism about giving people money, but what was really interesting was researchers have looked, and parents that did get extra money actually put that money to good use, things like basic needs. And in this time of inflation, I'd love to see that. So again, as a society, as a community, as a family, we need to support not only children, but families. And really comes down to this: if we really want to have breakthrough outcomes for children, we really need to work on adult capacities. And that's why, to me, it's nurturing both parents and children. And we'll talk about this later, but one of the reasons I'm talking about this material is this is part of the protective factors work for parents. And you saw on the slides with the Caltrin offerings, they're doing some really wonderful work on that. And we'll touch base on this aspect in a little bit, but again, this whole idea of supporting parents to support their kids is so critical. And, it's an interesting thing, because a lot of people have asked me, well, I built this program and I did this thing and parents won't come. And I said, but, if you really think about it, for me, being trauma responsive really, really is about understanding our parents' unasked questions or unspoken questions. And their first question is, are you safe? And that's physically, emotionally, mentally, and in our relationship. Can you actually see me? Do you understand me? And can you really help me? Do you have that skill? And then will you be around in the long run? And will you be around when things get tough? And, there's emotional hurt. You'll also get the pushback of, yeah, I've heard that before, because our families have been either traumatized or marginalized by our systems. And so I think this idea around being trauma responsive, going beyond trauma informed, is really important for us as a society. And in fact, this is part of some of the work that I'm working on about healing relationships, this being a part of it, the attachment relationship and compassion being the other parts. But we'll talk about two of those today, or we'll talk about the attachment piece of it a little later in this talk. So again, I just want to stop for a moment, take a breath. I've presented a lot of material. That's just kind of the background material. And I really want to help you see where we're locating this work and how it's all interrelated and really does fit under not only child abuse prevention, but also this idea of nurturing our children and nurturing our families. To nurture our children, we have to nurture our families. And I love the framework, the family protective factors, the strengthening families framework. And there's 5 components. parent resiliency, social connection, knowledge of parenting and child development. That's what we're talking about today. Concrete supports in times of needs. You'll see there's some linkages to that, but there's a whole important area of work there. And social emotional competency of children. That is somewhat related to what we'll be talking about today. And we'll be talking about some of this really kind of basic early childhood mental health stuff, which is also social emotional development. And I always tease my colleagues that we've made the term so complicated, people get turned off. It's just how are your kids getting along with themselves and with others? And so we'll talk about that as we go. So again, breaking this down, and this again comes directly from the Strengthening Families work from the Center for the Study of Social Policy. So what they want parents is to seek and acquire accurate and age and stage related information about parent behaviors that lead to secure attachment, the importance of being attuned, emotionally available to one's child, being nurturing and responsive and reliable, having regular, predictable, consistent routines, interactive language experiences, providing physical and emotional safe environment for one's child, and providing opportunities for your child to explore and learn by doing. Also, C is really, really important, appropriate developmental expectations. One of the more significant predictors of child abuse is parents that have unrealistic expectations of their child's development. So this is a really critical one. And this is part of the reason I love doing the work that I'm doing. The other part is positive discipline and recognizing and attending to your child's needs. So let's go here to the critical window. So I show you this slide, and it's kind of an interesting slide in the regards of, on one hand, it's a little bit busy, so I apologize for that. But what I really want to draw your attention to is the critical periods that are in the dark blue. So if you look at that, you see that vision starts right when we were born. But the next two are the ones that I really want to draw your attention to. The idea that emotional controls and habitual ways of responding, those critical windows start before in the first year of life. So thinking again how important that is, those early points in our lives. So again, you can, during critical windows is when you have the most opportunity to intervene and change things. And even though, as it says, critical periods wane, you can still make big changes for kids later in life. It's just harder. And so would really like to, focus early and helping kids with an early start. I apologize. I am dealing with a little bit of a cough, so you might hear me coughing along the way, and I might take a moment to catch my breath from here and there. So I apologize ahead of time. So development, it's it's a process that every child goes through. It involves learning and mastering skills like sitting, walking, talking, skipping, tying your shoes. And children learn these skills. They're called developmental milestones, and they're in predictable periods. Again, this is if we get to the bonus material, I'm trying to synthesize some of the newer stuff that's happening, but this is the classic way of learning about development. There are these 5 domains, and the first is speech and language. The second is gross motor, or the big muscles, moving like your arms and your legs. And then fine motor, which is the smaller muscles, which are things like writing, gripping, things like that. These are important. And then cognitive development, the ability to learn and solve problems. And then social emotional development. This is the child's ability to interact with others, and it includes helping themselves in their own self-control. So as we talk about this, you'll see that social emotional development is a little bit more complex. It's not as easy to follow, but because of that, the materials are a little bit more complex. So it's not anything too difficult. And I'm going to make sure that you have a good understanding of what you can help parents with and what you can look out for with your own kids. So just some terms. Surveillance is developmental surveillance is the system to regularly and routinely check for a child's development, and it involves everybody who interacts with a child: parents, childcare, grandparents, anybody can do surveillance. And we'll be talking about some tools for that. Screening is a standardized way of identifying kids who need more help or close observation, and connecting parents to resources. And then the next level is an evaluation or an assessment. When a child requires help, it's the process of defining that need and creating a plan with the family. And ideally, that plan is shared with everybody who's involved with the child. If you are in the situation where your child does have a higher level of need, it's great to be able to share that with their child care provider. And it may be something like difficulty with transitions. And so again, everybody who's involved with the child can then provide a more consistent way of helping the child. So again, developmental milestones. It's a skill that's acquired in a specific time frame. It's sequential, so it happens in order. Each milestone builds on the last one. And because children acquire milestones or skills, they do it in a specific frame, and we call it a window, and we can predict most kids will do that. So just again, for more detail, these are two great resources that you can take a look at. One is a little bit more on the general information, and the other one is age specific. But if you really want a great tool, it's the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, has a beautiful developmental milestone app, and it tracks kids' milestones from 2 months to 5 years. It has illustrated checklists. You can get tips for encouraging your child's development. You can find out what to do if you're ever concerned. And there's photos and videos in this app, and it just makes it a lot more fun and easy. And as you can see, I pulled off the little on Android, Google Play, and on the App Store. The CDC's done some really great work. And let me just stop for a second to share why they did this. One of the areas that they're really invested in is reducing child abuse. And it's really fantastic. One of the really great researchers at the CDC who helped do a lot of this work is now the president and CEO of Child Abuse America. So, these are just great things. Again, coming back to that idea that if parents have appropriate developmental expectations, it really does reduce chances for child abuse. So we're going to dive into a couple of the areas, and I picked the ones that are kind of the ones that are a little bit more common. Language delay, it affects about 1 in 10 children, and many problems persist through school and adulthood. That's why, again, if we can get them early, it's really important. The other part is that when you can't communicate, it really can create frustration and what looks like behavioral problems when truly they're communication issues. And classes and enrichment work for most kids, and we want to detect it and treat it early by years. Hopefully by your second year of life, we want to be aware of it. So there's different types of language delay. There's what's called receptive delays. That means taking in language and processing it. There's expressive, which is communicating. And we do have folks that are slow talkers, and we have kids that are slow learners, and it'll show up in their language. And again, with all of these kids, there are things that we can do to encourage and develop their skills. In the program that I work in the most, Healthy Development Services, and it's in San Diego County, we work with kids with mild to moderate delays. And this is the whole idea that 1 hour of speech and language treatment for a child won't help that much. But when you do that with the parent and you show the parent what they can do, and the parent is able to do this in their daily routine, it can make a big difference. And again, because we focus on the mild to moderate kids, it's great because we are intervening earlier, and we're seeing just incredible results over the last 16 years. So what does that look like in the first 6 months to a year? Little ones will respond to their names. They use a wide range of sounds. They make sounds like baba, mama, dada. They shake their head no. They understand a simple word or command. So this is in that first year of life. Then from 1 year to 18 months, they will use simple words. They'll ask for food or food or drink with words. They'll point to a desired object. They can show you the correct picture when you ask, show me the doggy. Of course, you have to practice that with them. And then in 18 months, they're able to follow some simple directions. They use at least 10 words. They follow two-part directions. They use two-word sentences, and they will sing and they'll enjoy singing and songs. And again, when we talk, when we get to between 2 and 3 years, they'll talk in 2 to 3 word sentences. About half of their language is clear to strangers. So it's important to say strangers, because parents end up adapting and learning their kids' language. They'll understand prepositions, in, on, under, beside. They'll use pronouns I, he, she, you. So we see those pieces. Now, one of the interesting studies that came out was some years ago. They actually recorded parents, the amount that parents were talking with their kids, and they followed those kids to 3 years of age. And what they found was there was a stark difference as it related to income. So in professional families, the kids had almost double the words of kids in whose parents were on assistance, like welfare. And then working class families were in the middle. So again, you can look at this information and you can wonder what's going on. Well, what's going on is the knowledge that talking to your kids and taking turns in language is important, and it's important to lifelong language development. I always joke that this slide is really important to me because I make my living with words. And so I think, having a large vocabulary and that word rich environment is really important, but it is. And what has been shown is this is not about socioeconomic status. It's about parents' exposure and knowledge to this information. So there's a great project in Harlem known as the Baby Zone, and they work with parents and they teach parents. And low-income parents, when you tell them and you teach them about this, they're as excited to do it as families that are more affluent. And so again, I think when we look at kind of leveling the playing field, it's one of the reasons I love this work is I think we can really help people get to their full potential, no matter where they were born. This is one of those areas. And I've spent a lot of time in this research, and there is some really fascinating research coming out right now about turn taking, that ability of going back, and that it's not just the amount of words, but it's how a parent interacts with their child. So again, everything that we're talking about today is so critical in this idea of lifelong success starting so early. Another interesting piece is parentese. It's when you're talking with kids, it is full grammatical speech. It involves real words. There's an elongated set of vowels, an exaggerated tone in the voice, and spoken directly to the child. It sounds happy and engaging, and it helps infants tune in socially to their parents and respond, even though if they're just babbling. So you'll see this happen naturally, but when you encourage parentese, it really helps kids. And parent surveys estimate that children with at 18 months, the vocabulary with coached families where they're coached on parentese is 100 words, where the families that are in the control group, it was only 60 words. So you can see that there's almost a doubling again of language. And so this area of really, learning how to interact with your child. In fact, that's this next slide. This is one of the things, again, that when families come to you and they ask you, what can I do for my child? This is one of the areas that's just great to emphasize the importance of the parent-child engagement, the nurturing relationships. And you can see that being face-to-face with an adult, the back and forth or turn taking, as I was mentioning, is so critical, and responding based on the child's behavior, the use of shared attention. That means that, again, we coach parents, like when you're teaching your child language, you have to have them looking at the same thing. When you say ball, they need to be looking at the ball, not at the wall. The use of social cues such as pointing and finger gaze to communicate with kids. And then again, this is a little bit more as kids get older, the power of play and child-directed play. Again, this is this whole idea of parents following the child and following the child's lead and encouraging them. And then we'll talk about temperament, but really adjusting to kids' individual temperament, ability, and needs, again, is really important, because what you're doing with kids is you're engaging them and you're helping them build skills. So you have to meet them where they're at and then move forward. Now, of course, with this piece, parent support and stress is really critical as well. So this is one of those pieces that's just so important, is, again, that coming back to supporting families. And through this pandemic that we've been through, we've also been through racial reckoning. We have inflation. We have a lot of things that are pulling on parents. And so again, I feel like we have to use these great disruptions as an opportunity to create a better society and figure out how we can better support parents. All right, I'll get off my political soapbox. Why screen? So again, I had talked a little bit about the language piece, just to give you an idea of what it looks like. But why do we screen? Well, it catches problems earlier. It allows for earlier treatment. It's effective and efficient, like we've been talking about, that early time period. And again, coming in those critical periods, if we can intervene in the critical periods, it's much less work. And one of the problems is most kids who would benefit from early intervention aren't identified until they get to school. Now, that has improved over time. And I know some of you are joining us from outside of California. I can speak to what's happening in California. Some of my examples will be California specific. Here in San Diego, we've been lucky because of our funding through First Five San Diego to actually have a project that intervenes earlier and identifies kids earlier. And we'll see what that looks like 20 years from now and the economic impact. I think it's going to be great. Our current state of screening is kids, 1 in 6 kids have needs, and a small percentage of those kids are identified. And it has been estimated that if we did catch kids earlier, we'd have increases. Well, actually, we do know that when we do treat earlier, we have better graduation from high school, better opportunities for holding jobs, better opportunities for living independently, decreased teen pregnancies, decreased delinquency, and decreased violent crime. If we do intervene early, we can save a lot of money, but more importantly, we can save a lot of pain. Jessica, I saw you popped in. Is there a question that?
Yes, thank you so much.
Great.
I wanted to find a natural break for you. There are 2 questions.
Great.
One question is, are there any social emotional development resources for ages 13 and up?
I get that question a lot. I will need to get back to you on that, because again, my work is really focused on younger kids. But the social emotional development in that age range is very important as well. In that time period, kids are going through a very critical period of brain growth. One of the books I like from that in that time period is something called Brainstorming by Dan Siegel. So it is a very critical period of time. And when toddlers are little, we need to co-regulate them. We'll talk about that later, but we also need to do that with teenagers. I think the idea of teenagers being independent and rebelling is kind of a misnomer. They're going through a rapid degree of growth. So let me do that, and we'll do a follow-up on resources.
Thank you. The second question is, as a home visitor who conducts frequent ASQs, it can be super frustrating when you see delays, and then when it's brought up to the doctor, they are told that every child develops at their own rate, so they don't want to have a referral to EI. Do you have any suggestions to get over this obstacle?
Yes, this one's a tough one.
Mhm.
So one of the reasons, again, I'll just be honest, one of the reasons I think pediatricians don't want to refer is the frustration of the systems. And so again, I think you can encourage, but you'll see all of these systems, parents can refer. And so it doesn't have to be the pediatrician only. And I think particularly home visitors, and actually that's the bulk of this presentation is around these questions of how do you do this and how do you get folks in there. I'm sorry, my cough is kicking in. So it's a great question. I think, again, encouraging and advocating with families so they can ask for what they need, particularly at the schools. We can't refer as pediatricians to the schools when the kids get older, and we'll be talking about that coming up. But the big piece is helping families have the language, giving them concrete pieces. And we'll also talk about later is while you're waiting for an evaluation, there are so many resources. And I cannot speak strongly enough about like how home visitors make a difference. And you don't have to be a developmental specialist. There are resources there, and home visiting programs. And again, depending on what model you're using, home visiting it's one of the areas, it's one of my passions, right? Is to get in there and teach families. You're doing what I would love to do as a pediatrician. I'd love to have that time in the family's home. But I do hear your frustration. And I think part of it also comes back to the limits in the resources. So again, we have to help families. We have to connect them. We have to truly empower families. And again, I think home visiting is one of the greatest ways to actually do that. So we're going to be talking about that coming up. And again, I also say, please contact me outside of here as well. I'm open to helping brainstorm, but really I tell people all the time, well, if the pediatricians aren't going to go along, just have the parents do it directly and help the parents really learn what the language is that they need to use to advocate for their child. And again, whether you're a home visitor, whether you're in a family resource center, this aspect of helping families advocate is so critical, because our families can get demoralized and they've been marginalized. And this element of support is so important. In fact, I talk about our program as an early childhood developmental system of care. I would say that we've really moved towards being a parent support program that delivers its support through developmental and behavioral services. And we are leading with that piece. And again, I just think that element of really empowering parents is so critical. So thank you for your question. It's a great question. And we'll be getting to some of that material. So again, thank you for the preview. All right, so I'm going to roll forward, and let's talk a little bit about the screening. So the AAP, my national organization, recommends developmental behavioral screening for all children during their well child visit at 9 months, 18 months, and 30 months. Now, I will tell you, this has been an area of concern during the pandemic because kids aren't coming in as much. People have been inundated by the pandemic, but we do need to keep doing this. Additionally, in terms of autism spectrum disorder, we recommend screenings at 18 and 24 months. So I'm going to show you what we're doing here in San Diego. It's just a visual of what we do with the younger kids. Again, developmental screening using the ASQ, the Ages and Stages questionnaire, which was in the question, but we'll talk about that coming up for those of you who haven't heard of that. And what we do is again, in our thing, we actually have this program here in San Diego called Healthy Development Services, where we do the assessments. But Early Start in the schools do that, and we'll be talking about those folks. And those are also treatment providers. So we'll be talking about that as we go forward. It can be, quite honestly, it can be very confusing. So an example of a screening tool is the Ages and Stages questionnaire. We're on the 3rd version. I hear the 4th version is coming out. It's composed of 19 questionnaires. It's designed to be completed by parents or primary caregivers. And the question intervals are, you can see the months below. And each questionnaire has 30 developmental items. Now, what's covered is, as we talked about, communication, gross motor, fine motor, problem solving, which is cognitive development, and then personal social, which is an aspect of social emotional development, which is really about taking care of themselves, like buttoning and things like that. There is a different, more complex one for the social emotional, and that's the ASQ SE2. It's the 2nd version, which we'll talk about as well. The basics for the ASQ are the reading level is 4th to 6th grade. Illustrations are provided when possible. Parents check yes, sometimes not yet. Program staff converts to a point value, and then from the point values, we look at cutoffs. Now, Easter seals is still allowing people to do the ages and stages questionnaire for free online. So there are those resources. And then, as I mentioned, the ASQ SE, which is the social emotional screening tool. It's designed just for social emotional. And again, like I mentioned earlier, that the ASQ includes personal social, but not some of the other areas. So this is just getting a little bit more into the details, but this really has 7 areas, key areas in behavior, looking at self-regulation, compliance, social communication, adaptive function, autonomy, affect, and interaction with people. So again, as I mentioned, it's a little bit more of a complex tool because behavior and social emotional development is simply more complex. It has 9 questionnaires. You can see that. And again, it has 30 questions, and there's a raw score that's compared to cutoffs where a child may need further assistance, where they should be monitored and re-screened, or where they're doing well. So again, 4th to 6th grade level, parents again will check yes, sometimes not yet. Again, this idea of not yet means not no. It's this will develop over time. And then again, program staff converts it over to the score and compares it to cutoffs. So one of the big things is really tailoring your communication to the families. The readiness to hear and act on the information is really critical in the work that I do. Parents' readiness is a very critical piece. We use motivational interviewing to really assess where they're at, assess families' emotional state, their education level, their cultural beliefs, their resources, and their ability to utilize the system. And all of this is in the vein of using this to encourage them to be involved in their child's development, encourage them to look for the resources and connect with the resources. And I have to admit to you all that the resources sometimes can be very, very hard to access for families, and they do need your help, and they do need hand holding. I don't even consider it hand holding. I consider it just helping families navigate incredibly complex systems. So we've been using the term early intervention. So what is it? It's a term that's used to describe services and support that helps babies and toddlers. And in most areas, that's birth to 3 with developmental delays or disabilities in their families. It may include speech therapy, physical therapy, and other services based on the child's needs. It can have a significant impact on the child's ability to learn new skills and increase their success for school and life. And the programs are available in every state and territory. And these are provided at free or reduced cost for kids that meet the state's criteria for developmental delays. Now, in California, we have moved our early intervention comes through what's known as regional center. And at regional center, the criteria have shifted to be requiring less of a delay, moving from 33% delay down to 25% delay. So that's great news. That means there's more resources, and many of those regional centers are moving towards hiring and increasing staff. And so that's a really big positive. But again, as I mentioned, it can be very complicated and hard for families to get in. And the question that we had earlier from one of our home visiting colleagues is, there's just a level of frustration of getting families to the services and in the services. And so, again, that really does vary from place to place. Here in San Diego, our regional center folks are excellent. They're very motivated to get families into services. So that's actually been a real positive for us. The other thing that I just want to point out that this is from the Individuals with Disabilities Act. This stuff comes from the 60s and 70s. Again, the level of funding is always so critical. So what is the language we can help families with, right? So when we, when you call your doctor's office, you say, I'd like to make an appointment to see my doctor because I'm concerned about my child's development, and be ready to share your specific concern. write it down on notes, helpful pieces. So again, our colleague who's doing home visiting shared that, she's doing that. And sometimes the doctor won't, make the referral. Then I just say, refer directly to the programs and help them advocate. I'm always disappointed. We did a lot of work here in San Diego to change that. But again, that funding came through First Five and it took a lot of work. And I myself am a pediatrician, and that's kind of how we made the changes from pediatrician to pediatrician. But again, being as specific and as she mentioned earlier, with the ages and stages, it's very specific that my child is behind here doing this. That should really help with getting services. So as I mentioned, there are programs for early intervention. And I mentioned the one from 0 to 3 is in California is called Early Start, which is a 0 to 3 program, which is housed at the regional center, but also works with the schools. Each school district is required to provide services through, again, federally legislated special ed dollars. Regional center also serves older kids for 13 different conditions. In California, and I think this is true in other places, we have something known as California Children's Services. This is for kids that have a higher level of not behavioral, of medical need. And this is a program that was designed for families so they don't go bankrupt if they have a child with special needs. And then exceptional family resource centers are generally parent-run organizations that help support families with a child that has a developmental delay. And they're just incredibly important organizations. That parent-to-parent peer support is very, very critical. And again, this is covering about 1 to 2% of kids. And as we mentioned earlier, 1 out of 6 kids. So, close to 17% of kids have a need. And if you actually look at kids that are at risk, the need's closer to 24%. So our match for programs and needs is out of alignment. And again, that's like as I say, for my day job, that's the work that I do, is trying to increase those services. So specifically, Early Start Regional Center, most kids up to 2 years, 11 months. They're a parent referral, like I said, with disabilities and some risk factors. Here in California, we've increased the eligibility, which I'm just grateful for. But increasing eligibility doesn't mean that we always have enough service providers like speech and language pathologists, physical therapists, occupational therapists. And as I mentioned earlier, it's part of the Individuals with Disabilities Act, and it's called Part C of that act. The school one is Part B. And I have a link here for the federal information. And again, it's at a state level. So again, this may sound a little repetitive, but it's built in for this reason, because again, I think we really need to work with arming parents with the right language to get the services their kids deserve. So when you call your state's early intervention services office, you say, I'm concerned about my child's development. I would like to request an evaluation. Can you help me, or let me speak with someone who can? So again, being very specific, being ready to share your specific concerns. This is where we can help families so much. You'll be asked for general information about yourself and your child, where you live, all that kind of stuff. And it's really important. This comes back to equipping parents, is write down who you speak with, the date, what was said. You might need the information later. Sometimes, even getting in for an evaluation can take 3 to 6 months, which drives me crazy, because 3 to 6 months in a 2-year-old's life is a quarter of their life. So, this is really important for us to advocate. So school ages, they take all ages. We'll treat deaf and blind under 3, otherwise 3 to 5 in parent referral. They must have more than one area of disability. There's a higher level of need for most schools, and they'll assess only in the suspected area of disability. So this is so important for parents to say, I'm concerned about my child's speech and language. I'm concerned about my child's social emotional development. I'm concerned about my child's gross motor. You have to be very specific here so that they evaluate. And treatment really does vary district to district. We have, I believe, something crazy like 40 some or 30 8 different school districts in San Diego County. So it's just so difficult to know who treats what. And again, if it's frustrating for me with my degrees, I can't even imagine how frustrating it is for parents. And that's what a lot of our staff does. Now, I do have to kind of throw out the caveat, which is our school districts, this is special ed dollars, right? So special education has never been fully funded. We have never, as a society, made the investment that we need to make in this area. So schools are asked to do this on top of everything else. And I'll be honest with you, during the pandemic, when my colleagues have complained about the schools, I look at them, I said, would you want to work there right now? Because they're just trying to keep their doors open. They're dealing with masks, they're dealing with kids being sick, they're dealing with all of these things. It doesn't excuse it. It's just a piece to remember that everyone's doing their best, and we really do better when we can find ways to help one another. So in addition to advocating for the services that we provide here in San Diego County, I'm always advocating for special ed. I'm always advocating for regional center. It's really our kids and our services. So we have to all be in this together. So similarly, when you call your school board, you need to say, I'm concerned about my child's development. I'd like to talk to somebody about having my child evaluate. Can you help me? Again, can you help me, or can you let me speak to someone who can? Same type of thing. Be specific about your concerns and write down the conversation, because again, you're going to have to refer. I really encourage parents to create a little book or a binder where they're keeping all that information. I know for myself, I try to do that with my medical information. I'm not always successful, but we're better with our kids than I am with myself. I am so sorry about this cough. I took cough syrup this morning. Children's services in California, are there specific diagnoses? Cerebral palsy, muscular dystrophy, epilepsy, Down syndrome. And again, this is diagnostic and treatment services, case management, and it does require physician referral. And there's a sliding scale for payment. There's some information about this. These are really truly are also for our medically fragile kids. As somebody who's worked in children's hospitals, some of our kids really end up with very severe birth issues, and we don't want families to become bankrupt from doing what's right for their kids. So this is a program that I think exists in most states, but this is the name we have for it in California, California Children's Services. As I mentioned earlier, there's something known as the Exceptional Family Resource Center, and it's the peer-to-peer support for families. In addition to activities, classes, and community resources in San Diego, our EFRC helps do intake for the regional center. And again, I don't know what's better than having a parent talking to a parent about their life. And so there's some contact information for that organization at the state level. And in California, we create a network of local partners dedicated to developing and monitoring early intervention services, and educating and training local providers, providing tools. And First Five in most counties has funded something known as Help Me Grow. So in many counties, there are folks that are trying to help bridge these gaps. And so again, for all of you in your counties, see if there is Help Me Grow. As I mentioned, in San Diego, we have what's known as Healthy Development Services. It's a little bit broader because we do what Help Me Grow does, as well as we provide treatment services. And that's, again, through funding through First Five. So either look up Help Me Grow in your county or your county's First Five to see what they're doing to help connect families. So I mentioned this next slide earlier. Unfortunately, families have to wait, many for weeks, sometimes months, before they can get into an appointment. It can be very frustrating for parents who want answers. And if you find yourself in the situation, there's some simple things we can do. Support parents as caregivers, show them examples to create secure attachments and healthy environments. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Helping them to foster play as an opportunity to learn and think and problem solve. use screening tools as educational tools to show parents how important they are in their child's development, and help parents put developmental activities into daily routines. The ages and stages, if you look up, there's tons of activities that they have with each one of their screening tools. If you put in the age and put ages and stages, 9 months, developmental activities, great materials pop up on the internet. I like to joke that there's some no-nos for parents or for adults. Don't compare children to other siblings or other children. Don't blame. It was actually with autism for a long time, it was thought that, or it was taught incorrectly, that autism was because the mothers were cold. So again, no blaming, don't give labels, and don't assume treatment's too expensive. And again, I'm bringing up our colleague who's home visiting. One of the things that pediatricians are taught, particularly the older ones, is we're going to wait and see if the child outgrows this. Well, they may or may not outgrow it. And even if they are going to outgrow it, we can do things to help them now. Okay, so let's talk about social emotional development, and let's see if I can keep off my coughing. Or, Jessica's coming to rescue me with a question so I can not cough for a moment.
Totally. So we have a few questions before we move into your next area here. One question is, let me just scroll up a little bit. I want to remind attendees, if you drop your questions into the Q&A, it'll just kind of help us keep them organized. The first question is, how is the autism spectrum disorder screening different than the ASQ?
Great question. It's a little bit more specific. It's a little narrower in what we're looking for. So it gives us a kind of a quicker piece of looking at things. Embedded in the ASQ are certain questions that help us. And as you use those materials, you get more keyed into which ones increase your level of concern. So it's built in, but the other one's a little bit more specific.
Do you recommend using the MChat for assessing for autism?
Yes, I do. It's a standard tool. The party line at the AAP is to say yes. I think it's good. I think it over refers. And so I think it's important to help parents understand that if their screen is positive, it may not still be autism. We need to be more specific, that we're just being very cautious.
As a pediatrician, how do you learn and stay informed about the resources in your community to referral families?
That's why I do what I do. My work is primarily to support my colleagues who are in practice so that they can send us kids and we can sort it out for them. I'm lucky because of the first 5 funding. It's very hard for pediatricians to do this. And I think we actually need to shift our care to team-based care, where the pediatricians have somebody who helps with this, helps with social emotional development, helps with social determinants of health, and that we use the pediatrician's office as a place of child wellness. Because again, I always share with people, I am not in day-to-day practice anymore because I've been so busy building systems and to support pediatricians in practice. But they're the hardest working, kindest people you could ever meet. And everyone says, can we have the pediatricians do? And I always say, no, we can't, because they already do so much. And every idea for screening, every idea, like the one that, if we get to, I'll talk a little bit about maternal depression, but people want pediatricians to screen for maternal depression. Where are they going to send the person? What are they going to do for them? We're asking them to do one more thing and we're not giving them resources to help. They would screen for it if they had a resource. Like who wants to screen for something and not have a resource? I just think we put people in really difficult positions. So in San Diego County, and again, I know we're very lucky with what we've done over the last 16 years, but we tell them, just send them to us. We'll sort it out for you, because they're hardworking and they're caring. And you don't want to make somebody who's a really good person feel bad. I mean, that doesn't make any sense, right? Also, just a little side note, we have a behavioral developmental committee in our local chapter, and my staff came with me when we did the what do you need in the community. And when they heard all of what pediatricians did and all of the things that they're helping families with, they were completely blown away. So they're trying, but we need to better support pediatricians, to better support parents, to better support kids. It's
Great. And the last
recurring
question
theme.
for this round, do you have any resources for handouts to talk with and give parents at each stage of development?
Yes, we will. And I can't, I thought I had links in here, but I will, in our follow-up, have links to, again, the ages and stages has just beautiful materials of what to work on at what age. And again, because it's so age specific, it's there, it's incredible, because just helping parents understand and having good quality materials. And the other part that I mentioned earlier is that whole idea of like building it into your day-to-day routine, right? It's like singing to kids in the car, just the things of building it into your day. So you're not enhancing development as a added work as a parent, but you're incorporating it into your work as a parent. And let's just be honest, being a parent is a lot of work.
Great. Thank you so much.
Sure. I'm so glad I put my dogs outside, because they are just barking so much right now. I think the mailman's here. They love to tell the mailman he's important. Okay, so social emotional development. So social emotional development includes the child's experience, expression, and managing of emotions, and the ability to establish positive and rewarding relationships with others. Again, this includes the ability to identify and understand one's own feelings, to accurately read and comprehend the emotional state of others, to manage strong emotions and their expression in a constructive manner. You can see that many adults haven't mastered that. To regulate one's own behavior, and to develop empathy for others, and to establish and maintain relationships. And if we think about it, one of the things that's been very interesting for me as a pediatrician is really understanding how much infants experience and express and perceive emotions. And this whole idea of learning how to recognize and label and manage and communication our emotions, it's something you build with family and peers and teachers and community. And even newborns attend to stimuli that resembles faces. They prefer their mother voices to others. Through nurturing adults, through nurturance, adults support infants' emotional regulation and responsive care, but giving supports infants in beginning to learn how to regulate their emotions. And if you remember that slide I showed you of habitual ways of responding early on, it is happening early in our lives. And emotions and cognition, so our emotions and our thinking, are completely interrelated. They're very interrelated. And most early learning in the early years occurs in the context of emotional supports. So I think we've made a mistake in trying to help low-income kids catch up, because we're so focused on them learning content. And sometimes we do that at the expense of the important richness of the relationships and having a consistent daycare. And again, I'm one who is, thinking of universal childcare for kids 0 to 8, not just, TK, which is fantastic. But I think we need to do more to support families and support the people who are in the childcare arena. So here's some social emotional resources. My colleagues at 0 to 3, I just love the work they do. I also love the work from the Center for Social Emotional Development at Vanderbilt, Cecil. It's very embedded into the work of early care and education, also known as daycare. It's a fantastic set of resources. So I always like to say, when we're distressed, we all need someone to respond to us. And if you look at this, you see in all these pictures, except that little girl in the middle, there's an adult with them. Now, this little girl has a good caregiver because she's reaching out for somebody. So this is just a really important point. It's true for all of us, even as adults. When something bad happens, we look for somebody to help us and to regulate and relate to. So this brings up emotional regulation. And again, we're talking about babies and young children really orienting to parents' reactions. And babies and young children regulate their internal emotions by asking for help. And parents can help babies and young children learn how to soothe themselves. And parents model how emotions are identified and coped with. And in some of our work, the things that blow me away is we have magnets of kids' faces with emotions, and kids as little as, 2.5 are identifying their emotions. And I just am always so amazed at the changes we've made over the years. So emotional regulation affects it affects a range of emotions and the nature of the infant's emotional reactions. Again, this varies from culture to culture. Ranges of emotions that are permitted at home, range of emotions that families tend towards, parenting styles and temperament. So we start seeing emotional regulation problems. Infants that are difficult to soothe, who are irritable, some kids with lower activity levels, kids with developmental delays. You can start seeing some of this stuff as early as infancy. By 3, kids that are acting out, that are aggressive, that lack compliance, that are withdrawing. They're telling guilty stories. They have decreased inhibition due to unusual situations, and also difficulty developing secure social relationships and connecting with peers and with adults. So as I mentioned before, we talk about stress, and as I said earlier, there's a talk that I do about the neurobiology of children, which is on the internet. And again, if you want to learn more about that, that's just a free resource that's there for you. But one of the things I always like to bring up is we talk a lot about fight and flight when we talk about stress response, and that's important. Some stress is good for us, like when we have a challenge or a new opportunity. We do have some positive stress. So remember, learning how to drive a car, it was a little bit stressful when we started, but now it's so routine. So stress can be positive. It's just when it goes on for a long time is when we start running into trouble. So, first we talked about fight and flight years ago, and then we started talking about, well, yes, there's some people that freeze. So those are the 2 big areas. But what I really want you to pay attention to is that one that says affiliate. And like I said, when we're stressed, actually the natural response is to reach out to somebody, to look for somebody. And the interesting part about that is the chemical oxytocin is released when we affiliate. So when we're stressed and we affiliate and we find somebody who helps us, it builds a relationship. When we think about temperaments, okay, hey, before I launch into this, why don't we just take a really quick 2-minute break for everybody? I know it's been a lot of information. So I want y'all just to take a 2-minute break. Jessica, we're at 11:05, right? Yeah. So why don't we just take just a quick 2-minute break? I know I've presented a lot of material, and I just want you guys to have a moment to reset before we dive into this next section.
Sure. We'll say be back. It's 11:06 now. We'll say be
Perfect.
back at 11:08.
Okay, so it's 11:08, so I'm just gonna jump back into it. Okay, so I know I presented a lot of information, a lot of resources. We're going to kind of get into a little bit more around the early childhood mental health, infant mental health kind of work, social emotional development, kind of a deeper level. So the area I want to talk about first is just temperament. So when we're born, we're sort of born with a way that we respond to the world. And temperament has been studied. I always joke that temperament gets a bad rap because it's associated with, people calling others temperamental. So, there's a real science to this, however. And when we're working with parents and we teach parents, it's been very much an aha moment for many parents when you start helping them understand that some of this is inborn. So there are scales, and if you look up temperament scales, there's some beautiful ones that you can just grab online that really look at these 9 different areas. One is activity level, persistence, the ability to continue, distractibility, initial reaction, adaptability, mood intensity, sensitivity, regularity, and sensory threshold. What's really interesting is sometimes our kids' temperament is one way and our temperament is a different way. And sometimes that mismatch can cause problems. But sometimes like, for example, with mood intensity, you can have a whole family that's very elevating. So again, it's just very interesting. Sometimes it's helpful, sometimes it's not, but most of the time when parents like kind of see that like this is kind of their child's inborn way of being and how they respond to the world from their biology, it really helps parents kind of say, oh, they're not doing that intentionally. So we've had a lot of success with parents by working with temperament scales, helping them look at their own temperament, look at their child's temperament, and the differences between the two. Oops, there we go. So one of the things that's really important to me, and probably the thing I just has more and more impacted my work, is attachment. And attachment is the quality of the relationship between a parent and a child that develops over time and a caregiver. And so it goes back and forth. And we'll talk about the stages of it. Attachment's a little different than bonding. Bonding is the relationship a parent feels for their child, even as early as conception. So bonding is really important, and attachment is a little bit more of a dynamic process. And what happens in attachment is there's this period of time of pre-attachment before kids are, when they're very little, 0 to 3 months, they'll accept care from anybody. Many of their behaviors are reflexes, but by 3 to 6 months, they start really kind of starting to develop a preference. And so I think even though this says 0 to 6 months, I think it does happen a little bit earlier. And what ends up happening is attachment begins, and kids will remember their caregiver. They're shy with others. They'll be upset being separated. They show happiness when they're comforted by the caregiver. So an infant will form attachments to any consistent caregiver who's sensitive and responsive in social interaction. So you can see then as kids get to that 2 to 3 year old age, they can understand and handle separation better. They can explore independently. And then, from, this says 36 to 60 months, I would say from 36 months from 3 years to the rest of your life, you really start getting into that level of attachment where you're independent but connected. And all of this stuff is really rooted in some incredible research. This research started with a gentleman named John Bowlby, who's a psychotherapist in England. And he really noticed the special relationship that a child will have with their caregiver. His work was followed by Mary Ainsworth, who actually created something called the strange situation. And she identified different types of attachment. The secure attachment is where a child will be distressed when their caregiver leaves, and they're happy when they're returned. And that's where the parent is responsive to the child's needs. So this is really important because, again, that habitual way of responding is so early. There are 3 insecure attachment types. One is when the mother or the primary caregiver is unresponsive and uncaring and is dismissive. And that leads to what's known as an insecure avoidant attachment. And that is the child does not get distressed when the parent leaves, and does not acknowledge the caregiver when they come back, and does not seek care from the parent. So you can see that unresponsive, uncaring leads to this habitual pattern of response. The insecure ambivalent is the parent will respond inconsistently to the child. So there is distress when the caregiver leaves, but they're not comforted when the person returns. Again, that inconsistency. And then there is a very small percentage where it's a disorganized attachment, and then the parent can be abusive and neglectful and responds in frightening ways. And then you really see no attachment behavior on the child's behavior. They often appear dazed, confused, and they're a little bit apprehensive when the caregiver comes back. So these are the 4 types that have been identified. And again, these are patterns that actually live and work lifelong. So, again, it's really the foundation for our relationships. The reason it's become so important in my work is I have started to see that for many of our families who've been marginalized and traumatized, what ends up happening is our teams are working with the families, and often we'll have 2, 3, sometimes even 4 different professionals working with the parent and their child. And those folks in our program really they really approach families in that trauma responsive way. And parents start creating attachment relationships that are reparative with another adult, our staff. And we're starting to see that sometimes the trauma starts resolving just on that alone. And so those caring relationships can actually be very healing. Now, I would say that attachment relationship is necessary, but not sufficient to heal trauma. But this is kind of the area that my own work is going towards, is how do we enhance these types of relationships? And just to think about this, like in your day-to-day context, is think about that in adults, right? So what does that adult look like who had a secure attachment? They're confident, they're non-reactive, they're resilient. You can see that if you grow up and you develop that insecure, anxious type of attachment, you really kind of end up being emotionally hungry. The idea of your connections are a little bit more in the way of a fantasy. Um, and again, down in the corner, you see the dismissive. You'll see folks that are kind of isolated, they're ambivalent, they're a little bit emotionally distant. What's very interesting is in many adult relationships, we see the insecure, anxious, and insecure, dismissive type in relationship with one another. So there's a real opportunity to heal that later in life. And then, for the one who's in that fearful category, you can see that there's internal conflict, there's drama, it's unpredictable. So again, I'm just sharing that this attachment stuff is really throughout our whole lives. And I just want to share with you a model, which I absolutely love, which is called the circle of security. And if you can see they talk about the two aspects of the attachment relationship, the secure base and the safe haven. So the upper hand is the secure base. It's if you think about your interactions with little kids that are well attached, they look back to you and then they go off to explore. So having a secure base from where you explore is really important. And if you see, how your attachment needs get met is by watch me, delight me, help me, and enjoy me. So that's that piece of like, I'm exploring, you're supporting their exploring on the top hand. The lower hand of safe haven is when the child is distressed and the actions are protect me, comfort me, delight in me, and help me organize my feelings and welcome me back to you. And it really is that piece of I want to explore, but I want that comfort when I get overwhelmed or I'm beyond my skill level. And the hands below are, always be bigger, stronger, wiser, and kind. And whenever possible, follow my child's needs. And whenever necessary, take charge. So this is not an approach that's just kind of, do whatever your child wants. It really is lead when you need to lead, but when you can, allow your child to develop that autonomy, that skill to be able to do things on their own. I love this work. These folks have been around for 30 years doing this work, and it's can be used in therapy. It can be used in parent education. And they just came out with a book called Raising a Secure Child. And these are the folks that develop this approach. And again, I think of this approach as something I'd like to see that really gets spread. And I just love the idea of be bigger, stronger, wiser, and kind. So if you want to, just look up Circle of Security. They have some wonderful videos. And again, I really think that this is an approach that it works with young kids, it works with teenagers, it works with coworkers. It's really important. And part of the magic of this is attunement. And so Dan Siegel, who's another person whose work I like and I reference for teenagers, he has a book out, I think, called Brainstorming, which I think is very interesting. When we attune to others, we allow our internal state to shift and we become in resonance with the other person's inner world. And this resonance is at the heart of an important sense of feeling felt that emerges in close relationships. That sense of feeling felt is, again, when I was talking about in traumatized and marginalized families, if they feel like you can really see them, they feel felt and heard and known, it changes their ability to interact. It's such a positive piece. And children need to feel attunement, to feel secure, and to develop well. And throughout our lives, we need attunement to feel close and connected. So again, these are some of the basics. So, what does that look like? Well, in little ones, a caregiver sees a baby crying, recognizes the baby's hungry, picks up the baby and feeds her. In an adult relationship, it's when somebody says, "Oh, I'm fine," and they don't mean it, and you dig a little deeper. So again, with our children, we need to know their feelings and motivations, analyze their actions and interpret their cues appropriately, and provide a correct response that meets their underlying emotional need. And that's, again, this whole piece of attachment work. It's really about looking at those needs. So if we look at social skills, kind of just going back to those pieces of the milestones, when kids are little and under 6 months, they have that social smile. They can distinguish their mom from others. They'll smile, coo, or pat their own image in a mirror, which is just a little one doing. From 6 months to 1 year, they reach for familiar people. Like we saw that little one who was distressed, plays social games like peekaboo or patty cake, pushes away unwanted things, drops the requested object into your hand. They won't do that all the time, but they just can do it. That's the important part. Within 1 year to 18 months, they give hugs and kisses. They hug a dollar stuffed animal. They'll greet you with a hi. They come to the parent for help, and they get your attention by pulling on your hand or your clothes. At 18 months to 2 years, they'll say no when interfered with. We know that no is one of those favorite words that time period. Usually responds to correction, shows sympathy for other kids, rocks, dresses, or feeds a dollar stuffed animal, and is really starting to build that sense of self. And social skills from 2 to 3, they'll play with other kids. They'll help with simple tasks. They'll play a role in pretend games. They often become frustrated because, again, they're learning so much. And as we mentioned, autism is a developmental delay, a disability caused by differences in our brains. And people with ASD may behave and communicate and interact in ways that are different from other people. And now we're looking at, when we think about what's known as the autism spectrum, it's about 1 in 44 kids. It's a pretty common marker or a common condition. And early intervention is crucial. So again, we had mentioned the MCHAT earlier. There's another one on the ADOS. There's some other ways to look at it, but again, the MCHAT is a really good way to start. So with autism, there's concerns around language. There's delays in language. They may lose some language skills after a year. There's no eye contact when making a request. Sometimes a sing-songy robotic voice. Sometimes repeats without understanding. Doesn't sustain or start a conversation. With social skills, avoids or does not keep eye contact. Again, this is not in all cases. These are just some of the things we see. Does not show facial expressions like happy, sad, angry, and surprised at 9 months. Doesn't play simple interactive games by 12 months. Uses few or no gestures by 12 months. Doesn't share interests with others at 15 months. It does not point to show you something of interest by 18 months. Does not notice when others are hurt or upset by 2. Doesn't notice other kids enjoying them by the time they're 3. Doesn't pretend to be like something else by 4, and doesn't sing and dance or act by 5 years. There's also restrictive or repetitive behaviors or interests. They'll line up toys or other objects and get upset when the order's disrupted. Some of that's true in all kids, but this is a more extensive. Repeating words or phrases over and over. Plays with a toy the same way every time. Is focused on a part or an object, like hyper-focused. Gets upset with minor changes. Has obsessive interests. Must follow a routine. Flaps hands or rocks body. Spins self in circles. Has unusual reactions to the way things smell, taste, or feel and look. So again, it's important to look at this in the context of you have a concern, but you need to take it deeper to an evaluation. So let me stop for a second and start talking about little bit different element of social emotional development or development, which is executive function, which I think is a funny name, but really executive function is the idea that we're learning to control our behavior, pay attention, and develop thinking skills like attention, memory, attaining goals, monitoring the flow of information, and problem solving. So a lot of this is around cognition, but really what this comes into is the development of what's known as the frontal lobes, or the front part of your brain. And part of executive function really requires self-regulation. And self-regulation is important. In fact, it's really seen as one of the most important things for lifelong success. And self-regulation is taking information in from our environment and figuring out what is useful and tuning out what's not useful. And it depends on our level of stress, and it depends on our level of arousal. It's critical to self-control and our ability to form relationships. So again, it's part of social emotional development. And what I really want to get at is these pieces, we're talking about them as if they're different pieces, but they're all actually very interrelated. And so when you think about, I use the word arousal, and that really is really about like our state of where we're at. So when we're calm, alert, and present, we learn best. But when we get overwhelmed, we can become hyper alert, and we can actually become flooded. So that's that fight and flight response. The other part is we can become lower in our alertness. We can become drowsy and we can sleep. That's dissociation. So we can actually get upregulated and downregulated. And we actually need to do that for babies because they can't do that for themselves. And so if you think about self-regulation, it allows kids to manage their emotions, their behavior, their body movements when they're faced with a situation that's tough to handle. And it allows them to do that while they're staying focused and paying attention. And I like to think about a car as a metaphor. Think about how the parts work together, right? You have an engine, but you have an accelerator and you have brakes, but you also have what's in the gas tank and a gauge of your speed, your speedometer, as well as your tires. But you also need to consider things that are outside: the road, the weather conditions, the traffic. Excuse me. I was doing really well there. As I mentioned before, babies can't regulate themselves. They have a huge amount of brain growth. And the primary caregiver really serves as an external regulator, an external brain. And as I mentioned, they can sometimes help a baby calm down, but sometimes like babies will be drowsy. You need to wake them up to get them to eat. And so being regulated by someone externally helps a baby learn how to self-regulate down the road. So if you think about it, here's the parent and the baby, and they're really intertwined. And then as we go, kids learn to self-regulate. Okay. Again, I feel like that was just a lot of information. So I want to stop for a moment and check in on questions and how people are doing, how they're regulated.
All right, so we have a question. I'll read it slowly so you can have your glass of water. The question is, how can I, as a parent, boost my children's self-esteem?
Okay, I love the question. Okay, so self-esteem has been very, very interesting and very misunderstood. So when we think about self-esteem, how do you really gain self-esteem? It's by having challenges that you're able to meet on your own. Now, one of the things we talk about a lot with kids is what's known as scaffolding. And so, when you go by a building and there's that thing outside the building that's there that helps when you're building it, it's a scaffold, right? And we talk about helping kids like gain mastery or gain skills. So you have to meet them and help them with that next step. Now, if that next step is too big, you're going to feel like I can't do things, right? I'm going to feel like I fail, right? If it's not far enough, it's not enough of a challenge. Kids internally know when we're praising them for something that they could already do. It doesn't work, right? So again, it's really important with self-esteem to praise kids for their effort, to help them navigate when they quote unquote fail something, to turn it into a learning opportunity. And it's really, I always joke that it comes back to me do, like when they're little, like they'll say me do, and you help them with it, but you help them enough, right? So that they're developing at their level of skill, right? So you're just helping them extend their level of skill. And this element of self-esteem is so important because I think we've come to this point where so many kids who are in their 20s now grew up being praised all the time, and they didn't feel like they deserved the praise. So they have an empty sense of you're great. And again, it's not about you being great. It's about what was your effort. And so I think that's the place to help kids, is helping them be successful without being too helpful. It's really finding that blend. That makes me think of a book that I love that really exposes some of these ideas. And they actually have a whole chapter dedicated to this. It's called Nurture Shock. And I'll have to, we'll see if you know, if I can remember, we'll put that in our list of things to follow up on. But they actually look at this research. And so it's really important to help your child have challenges that are reasonable challenges, not too much, not too little. Now, let me kind of switch gears on that piece as well. If you think about that, often when we're working with families, if we help them set goals, it's really interesting. Somewhere along the way, someone helped us learn how to problem solve, right? And if we help families with goals, it's really important to break those goals down into what are the steps. The reason being is if you have an idea of a goal and it's too big and you don't know the steps, you're setting yourself up for failure. But one of the reasons why it's so important, and this kind of relates to self-esteem, but as it relates to adults, if you help an adult make a plan and help them be successful at it, it helps their self-esteem as well. And more importantly, it helps them develop a sense of hope. And to me, hope is just simply my future can be better than my today. So when we build a goal and we have a kid reach that goal, it builds self-esteem. If we help a parent or a family or another adult plan a goal and meet that goal, it builds self-esteem. Each of those things makes you start thinking, hey, my future can be better than my past. And that's a really key element because resiliency is important. Resiliency can get us back to where we were, but hope moves us forward. And resilient behavior is informed by hope. So again, I think this is really important to really right size the challenge to help them have a sense of success and a sense of mastery and a sense of skill building. And I don't know about the rest of you, but like I'm constantly building skills and, you know, I'm constantly learning, and you're here today. So there's a reason that you're here. You want to learn and you want to grow in your skills. And so I think that's really important. All right, Jessica, you disappeared.
Those are all the questions we have.
Oh, okay. Okay. So let me go ahead and talk about postpartum depression. So postpartum depression, I think, is really important for us to talk about parent mental health. And we've been screening for parent mental health, and we screen for not just depression, but anxiety. And, you know, again, postpartum depression, the screening is more accurate after 4 to 6 weeks. There are a couple of tools that are very commonly used. One is the Edinburgh, which I prefer what's known as the PH2, the parent health 2, and that 2 questions is part of a larger one, which is the PH9. And that really is a great way for screening for not only depression, but for domestic violence and drug abuse. And why is this important? Well, it affects attachment and infant mental health. And we see that, you know, when mothers are depressed, there are developmental delays. And when the mother is treated, those delays disappear. So again, this is so important in terms of being protective for kids. Now, we talk about postpartum depression, but I do have to expand it to parent mental health. And I have a really good colleague who works here in town, Danny Singley, who always reminds us to think about father's mental health, paternal mental health. And it's really interesting, but you know, when mothers are depressed, often their partners are depressed too. So you can see how that will really impact a family's environment. So I think it's important to look for in the postpartum period, but I think it's important to look for throughout a child's life. My work is again focused on 0 to 5, and we screen all the way 0 to 5 because again, parent mental health anytime during this period is going to have an impact on the relationships, and so that's very critical to me about that. So, and the research on anxiety is also very interesting because anxious parents don't always read their kids' cues. I'm sorry, not clues, cues. And because of that, we get disconnections in those opportunities to enhance a child's development. Okay. All right. Now we're going to go into a little bit more of a conceptual area. So please bear with me on this one. So I am working on some material, and this material is really looking at what I call the 6 areas of the developing mind. And this is this piece that I was saying that, again, I have shared with you the classic way of looking at development. There are these developmental areas, speech and language, gross motor, fine motor, cognitive, and social emotional development. I think it's really important. I think the work that's been done is really important to look at it. I love, what I shared with you about the CDC and the tools that are there. So these things are all really important. So I'm very happy about that piece. However, everything's interconnected. So this is how I've been thinking about it. So, if you look at the bottom of this diagram, the little area in the red, it's our brainstem. And that is really where our sensations come from. And that really is our physical world. If you move up to the middle part of the brain called the limbic system, which includes things like the amygdala, it's our emotional frame. And, really the key question there is am I loved, right? So the physical one is, am I safe? The second part is, am I loved? And then, as I was mentioning, that front area, the executive state, the prefrontal lobes, what can I learn from this? And that's our thoughts. And then, this question about self-esteem comes back to the sense of self and who I am. So what are my beliefs? The next level, which is, again, not located in the brain, is the social relationship. What is my connection to others? Who are my family? Who are my friends? And then there's an aspect of our interrelatedness, our prosocial, and you can even call it our spiritual self, our sense of feeling the needs of others. And the key question there is, who can I help and how can I make this world better? It's the interconnectedness. So if you look at that, again, I don't want to fall into the trap that, our mind is our brain, right? It's not. Our mind is getting input from our brain, from our body, and our heart. Now, somebody says, isn't the heart part of the body? Yes, it's part of the body, but the heart is a pretty specialized organ in the way that it pumps blood through the system, but it also represents our emotional center. And so these 3 centers, the head, the heart, and the body, are really critical. And as we've been talking about, the energy and information to our minds is affected by our physical state. So if we're tired, if we're sleepy, if we're hungry, if we're thirsty, it impacts us. I'm sure many of you have heard the word hangry, meaning that I'm angry and hungry. And so that's a really great example of it. So as I do teaching around this area, and I've been sharing and speaking about this, is really kind of put this into this place of our sensations, emotions, thoughts, and our beliefs. And that's our inner world. And so much of what we've been talking about today is the inner world between 2 people, right? So, when you're a parent and the child is a smaller version of a parent. So a lot of what we're doing isn't just our words. Really the interaction between a parent and child, there's so much nonverbal communication. There's really a transmission of not only just words, but ideas, thoughts, and beliefs. We transmit them back and forth. And as I mentioned before, with babies, you don't have that thought part of it. So this is the part where babies are so amazing, because again, what happens early in our lives and what happens in this time period really is all emotion and sensation. And this is why that secure and safe base is so important. And this is why, again, that, the work of really supporting parents in that early part of life is so important. I like to say that, in civilized societies, there are 3 to 5 adults around a baby. And the mother is really allowed to do her most important job, which is to take care of herself and recover and take care and bond with her and attach to her baby. I would love to see us change as a society where we actually went every time a baby was born and supported that mom and family in the early first 100 days of life, and really literally wrapped around those families to get a really good start. What would happen in our development, right? So I had mentioned the picture of the brain, kind of just using that as a metaphor. And if you look at it, this is really what I want to kind of leave you with, this thought. Yes, all of these areas are important, but again, it's our physical, emotional, mental, social, and pro-social or spiritual development, which are interrelated, right? So what we do with our bodies, it impacts other areas of our work, right? Of our development. So you can't develop language without the mental and physical piece of it, right? So there's so much interrelationship in what we do. And I hope what really came through in this talk is how important relationships are for the developing child. They're just really critical. And what is it? It's all mediated through the sense of self. So that's one of the reasons why I love that question about self-esteem, because everything is informed by this sense of self. So I'll just give you a quick example of my development in growing up. When I was growing up, my brother was a star football player. He was an amazing athlete. I, however, am not. And when I was going into high school, my dad said, "Well, I'm not signing that paper for you to play football." I'm like, "But Dad, I want to play football. I've been playing football." And he looked at me, he goes, "You have to go to what you're good at. Don't try to do what you're not good at." And it was a hard lesson. And it impacted my sense of self, impacted how I think of myself in a physical sense. But he was right. I was better at communicating. I was better at leading, and I was better at debating. And so I went into those areas, and I was able to develop my strengths, not the areas that weren't my strengths. But all of those are interrelated into my sense of self and my sense of identity. So that's what we're trying to do with kids, is really help them go to their strengths, help them learn. So the next slide's a little bit busy and complicated, but this is what I'm working on, is the idea when you break down what are these dimensions. So let's go to the bottom, right? So like I mentioned, we talked about gross motor and fine motor, but there's other areas of our physical development, our proprioception, our moving around where we are in space, our interoception, what's happening inside our bodies. It's part of our physical selves. And as development has evolved, we still have to hold on to the traditional ways of looking at things, but we're learning more. So when you look at the emotional piece, it's understanding, recognizing, and regulating emotions. Mentally, it's cognition, concentration, problem solving, communication. And as I mentioned, that connects to physical. You have to hear and you have to be able to talk. Imagination and memory. These are part of our mental development. The sense of self. It's our self-esteem, our identity, our mastery, our morality. And with the social, it's our attachment, a temperament, attunement, interactions, and relationships. And pro-social is our caring, empathy, compassion, and service. Sorry. And you can see up in the top corner the role of relationships play, regulation, co-regulation, teaching, and modeling. We develop in all of these areas through relationships, play, regulation, co-regulation, teaching, and modeling. And so the model that I'm working on right now to teach parents and others is this. If you think about it, at the heart of everything is our connection and our relationships. And like we saw with the circle of security, on one hand, we want the challenges and the growth, but we also want comfort and care. we want to take information in, and that's our curiosity, and we want information to go out, which is our creativity. It's our expression. And so if you think about these ways of thinking about this across all of those domains of development, that's the direction my work is going in. So again, I really shared with you the classics. I shared with you what the resources are out there. But I think the new direction of where we're going incorporates all of this work and the interrelatedness and the interconnectedness. So just to summarize, excuse me, children are born with the capacity to learn, and the quality of a child's relationship with their caretaker nourishes that capacity. And with secure attachment, quality emotional regulation, and a supportive environment, each generation can surpass the previous one in development and learning. Now that's the summary, and I do just want to add a couple of things that aren't on the slides before I take some questions. So I'd love for you to really start thinking about questions, because I want to leave about 10 minutes at the end so that there's time for questions. The thing I want to have you consider is, how has the pandemic impacted development for kids? So I just finished giving a keynote talk on this, and I just wanted to share with you a couple of things that we're seeing and things for us to consider as a community. What we're seeing is delays in development across the board for our little ones. And when we think about it, it makes sense, right? They have less exposure. There's been isolation. And again, there's no one experience for the pandemic. The pandemic has been an experience that really, there's a lot of variety to that experience. But what we're really seeing, if we really narrow it down, is we're seeing delays in speech and language and in social emotional development. Those are the two areas that are standing out. And you can see that, as I've been emphasizing, the turn taking and some of the language development, some of that stuff hasn't happened. And it hasn't happened because of not having like caring grandparents, daycare, being exposed to other folks because we've been isolated. So that's one part of it. The other part is our families have experienced enormous amounts of stress. And not only has there been COVID, but there's been racial reckoning, and there also has been inflation, political unrest. There's a lot going on. And so I think our kids are missing some of these key windows. And so I think we're going to have to, as a society, look at these milestones, look at these standards, and look at what opportunities were missed for kids, and actually think of development in a wider way, in a wider piece. Now, on one level, it's daunting and depressing. On the other level, it reminds us that each kid is an individual. And when kids are in special education, they get an individual education plan, an IAP. I'm of the belief that maybe every kid should get an individualized learning plan, and maybe it should be in individual and family learning plan for us to think about, how do we best support individuals and how do we best support families, knowing that we've gone through this period of incredible stress. Again, talk about once in a lifetime. I hope it doesn't happen again. But we've really been through a really tough time period. And I would like to take the opportunity of this tough time period to come back to this work around development and say, how do we develop a more caring, more nurturing society? So I'm going to leave us with that thought, that I do believe that from all of the challenge that we've had, all the stress that we've had, that we can process that stress. We can grow from that stress. We talk about stress and trauma, but we don't always talk about post-traumatic growth, in that trauma does happen, but when we process what has happened, we become stronger. And so I would like for us to think about, as a society, we've been through a lot of chronic stress and trauma collectively. And can we come back to development and look at how development puts us in the position to learn how to emotionally process some of this challenge so that we become stronger, caring, and more nurturing to one another, and come back to what really matters, which is each other. So I really, really appreciate the time with you. I could talk about this stuff for hours. In fact, I've done the same talk over 9 hours, expanding it, talking more about each dimension and what parents can do. But today we've got a couple of hours. Really, really appreciate your time and attention. And I'm right at that point where I have 10 minutes for questions.
You do. And thank you again so much. Really, really appreciate just the content and your expertise. We do have some questions.
Great.
What we'll try to do is we'll try to provide you with questions that are very specific to your talk, but you are such a subject matter expert. Some people do have some maybe more specific questions as
Mhm.
well. Okay, so you might have mentioned something called guilty stories. Can you talk about what are guilty stories?
Yeah, so that's it. Thank you for bringing that up. It's a curious little piece. So generally, again, when we're looking at sort of the storytelling and the kind of morality and stuff, let me just back it up. Kids lie. They just do. I mean, it's just part of growing up, right? They just tell these little stories, and it's not a moral deficit. It's just we have to teach them why it's important to be accurate in our stories and to be truthful. So you have to teach that. That said, when kids have early traumas, they will tell stories that, again, imply guilt. And it's not just their own guilt, it's the guilt of what others have done. So when you're hearing stories, and this is, again, one of those things, when you spend a lot of time with 3-year-olds and you start hearing their stories, if you hear kids talking about stories where people are guilty or there's something that's happened, we need to really look for what happened earlier in that child's life, right?
Mm.
And I will just share with you all, I got trained as a community member, not as a mental health professional, in a therapy called parent-child psychotherapy. And I have to be honest with you, I was completely blown away, because sometimes kids are acting out things that happened when they were in utero or when they were really early before they had words, but they will act out parents in domestic violence situations with dolls. And when you help them make sense of it, it actually does something that allows them to process it. And had I not seen this, had I not been trained in it, I wouldn't have believed it, just to be honest with you. It's really remarkable. And again, it's remarkable what happens in that little bubble that I showed you of adult and baby, because it's all sensation and emotion with no thought when they're babies. They're, before words. So again, storytelling is a really critical piece. There's a whole area of work called narrative therapy as well, which is great with adults. So hope that's helpful.
Thank you. There was a question about, the importance of identifying strengths so that children can grow in these strengths, right? Great example you gave about football.
Mhm.
And you might have touched on this, but maybe you can expand. How do we help children improve though in areas where they maybe don't excel? Children might be easily discouraged when they aren't successful at
Mhm.
their first try. You had mentioned scaffolding. Maybe you can expand on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to expand on that, because again, everything that we learn, we're enhanced by learning with somebody who's more skillful at, right?
Mm.
And so what it really is about breaking things down into the pieces so that they can learn what they can do to be skillful. I don't remember when my parents taught me problem solving skills, but I know that they did. They were really great about sort of setting opportunities and expectations that I could meet and breaking it down to help me understand what worked. Now, the other part that's really important, and I didn't mention this, um, my father was one of the most amazing fathers. He was so good at encouraging us as well, right? So there's the encouragement and there's the right size of the challenge, and there's the piece of helping with persistence. Now, I'll be honest with you, when we look at temperament, I don't have the same level of persistence my brother does. It's kind of funny. I'm more likely to go, oh, okay, I'm going to give up and try something else and go towards my strength, right? But my father was really, really good at saying, oh, keep trying, give a little bit more. Oh, you can do it. And you did do it. But he always had a great way of encouraging us in the areas that we weren't good at. So it wasn't just do strengths, it's the complete development, right? So just because I couldn't play football, he did encourage me in other sports. But it was really great because my brother really was a star athlete. I was not going to be a star athlete. And so my brother has a real positive sense of self-esteem from that. I have a real positive self-esteem from, talking and debating and things like that. So again, he helped us move towards our strength, but he also encouraged us in our areas of weakness too. So you have to encourage, and again, you also have to moderate it based on a child's temperament, right? So we always want our kids to have that persistence. I have 3 stepsons. Our oldest one, you will never stop him on anything. That boy has persistence like you couldn't even believe. Like, I don't even believe it. Like, he does stuff that I'm like, good Lord, how did you do that? And the 2 younger ones do not have it. And so we have to parent differently.
Great. This one, do you have any thoughts on where kind of potty training might fall in the categories of development?
Oh yeah. So, it's interesting because Brazelton's work was so lovely because he said, well, we shouldn't be talking about milestones. We should be talking about like what happens. Like, potty training is part of a milestone. Now, the thing about potty training, again, very culturally bound, very different between boys and girls, but again, very different between individuals. So when kids are ready, it's really important to, have positive ways to encourage. And again, the no shame piece. I can't tell you how much I've talked about this as a pediatrician. It is such an amazing area of frustration for parents. And kids can regress. I had one kid who just, he was like 3.5, and, his father's a pediatrician, no less. And he just said, he goes, well, don't you want to? And the kid looked at me and goes, no, I don't want to. I want to poop in my diaper. So it is a very important developmental milestone. There's a range of where it happens. So part of it is biology. Some kids can't feel that, and that has to develop that sensation, the sense of control. But then there's also the willfulness. And so again, it's really a mix of stuff. And so again, I come back to each kid is very unique in their pieces. And there's lots of resources for different ways of approaching it. But again, I found it like sleep. There's a lot of ways to approach it.
Great. Now you've provided something that participants should know is you've provided some incredible resources that are going out in the 2-day follow-up. That 2-day follow-up will include resources. It will also include a link on how you can watch a replay. And someone said, could I share this replay with a colleague? Yes, and you'd be encouraged to. I think this is wonderful information to know. However, I'll ask if you think about the times where you were working, maybe advising providers or parents, and do you have any fan favorites, maybe resources that come to mind for you, podcasts, books, websites that you found yourself talking about quite a bit that everyone should maybe have bookmarked on their computer or on a shelf that you would recommend to the professionals on this call that might be engaging with families every day?
Yeah. So that circle of security book that I showed, I joke with people as I love the model, and I read that book, and that book's the one for parents. They also put out one that's for people that are doing interventions that have more examples. So highly recommend that. When it comes to trauma, the book that I'm recommending right now is What Happened to You by a dear colleague and teacher of mine, Bruce Perry. And he did it with somebody that everybody knows, Oprah. So he and Oprah did it. And I highly recommend the audible of it with that, because it's the 2 of them having a conversation. Great. So those are attachment, trauma. Again, that book, Nurture Shock, was really interesting. Brings up some areas that make us think that, the research says something and common wisdom says something else. And again, Barry Brazelton and Touch Points, can't speak highly enough about him. Very kind, understanding, warm, just an old-fashioned gentleman. Was just an amazing teacher.
Wonderful. Well, it looks like we are landing right on time here at noon. And we just want to thank you on behalf of Caltrin, Dr. Gidwani, on behalf of the attendees today. Thank you so much for bringing your expertise and such an engaging conversation. You'll start to receive the thank yous in the chat more. For those that are attending or you're watching a replay, you should note that the resources for this event will be either sent in your 2-day follow-up, or they'll be housed wherever you're watching this replay. I'll also remind you that you do have an opportunity to receive a certificate of attendance for today's session. We're going to drop that into the chat a couple of times. And you can click, be a very brief survey, about 2 minutes or less. And at the end of that, you'll receive a certificate of attendance. So thank you all so much. I hope you have a wonderful afternoon. We can't wait to see our presenter back in December. Don't forget to go register for that. And we'll see you again soon. Thank you, everyone.